Hello, this is Mark Tooley, President of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, with the pleasure today of speaking with Jim Antle, editor at the Washington Examiner, and on a personal level, a fellow Methodist, one of the 3 or 4 conservative Methodists of the Washington, D.C. Area. You can guess who the 1 or 2 others are. But he has written a very good article on evangelicals and how they relate to the election of 2020. Of course, evangelicals, white evangelicals, are a key demographic for Republicans and typically have voted for Republican presidential candidates by margins of from 74 to 81%. So, Jim Antle, thank you for joining this conversation, and tell us what role evangelicals are playing in election 2020.
It's good to be here, Mark. Thank you. Evangelicals, white evangelicals, are a very important part of the Republican electoral coalition, as you say. When George W. Bush ran for re-election and was reelected, 1 out of every 3 votes cast for him in 2004 was cast by a white evangelical. And if anything, that proportion has only grown in recent years when added together with conservative Catholics and other religious conservatives. Religious conservatives are clearly the largest single voting bloc within the Republican Party. And so this year it's going to be very important for President Trump, if he is to also win a second term, to not only win evangelicals by a large margin, as he did in 2016, but turn them out to vote. There was a very big difference in evangelical turnout between 2000 and 2004, which many attribute to the difference in the popular vote in those elections. And clearly, particularly in battleground states where evangelicals are numerous, such as North Carolina, Florida, it's going to be really important for President Trump to turn those voters out. And he has developed a relationship with that voting bloc that seemed really unlikely when he was first thinking of running for the nomination in 2015 or so.
And if I recall correctly, evangelicals supported President George W. Bush's re-election in 2004 by 78%.
That's right.
With John McCain in 2008, they were down to 74%. With Romney, yeah. Were they back up to 78%, or was it
Romney?
They
did get back up to 78%. There are some questions about whether the turnout among white evangelicals was as good as it could have been, but certainly in terms of his overall vote share, he did on the higher end. However, Donald Trump in 2016 outperformed them all, winning 81% of the white evangelical vote, and Trump is going to need to do something along those lines again in 2020 if he is to win re-election.
And is there any sign at this time that the margin for the president's re-election would be anything less than 81%? Could it go any higher, or is that pretty much a max for any candidate?
It would seem to be close to maxing out. It's possible they could get a point or 2 more. There's also a lot of hope that they can register additional evangelical Christians to vote. They are also right now overperforming in a lot of polls among Hispanic voters. It's suspected that Hispanic evangelical Protestants are a major driver of that, which is a very interesting phenomenon, given that President Trump has been involved in a lot of race-related controversies. The voting bloc he seems to have alienated the most is suburban white voters. He is doing about as well with minority voters as Republican presidential candidates tend to do. He might even do a little bit better than the norm, overperforming a little bit with African-American men, and again with Hispanic voters. So I think the main concern the Trump campaign has with white evangelicals is, will they turn out in proper numbers, in the numbers that they really need, and keeping them motivated to turn out. There doesn't seem to be a lot of sign of slippage, particularly given that Trump has proven to be a more reliable social conservative than people had any reason to assume he would be during the initial campaign. During the primaries, he really was not the preferred candidate of the organized Christian right. Senator Ted Cruz was. There were others who were supporting Senator Marco Rubio, even Ben Carson, the neurosurgeon and popular inspirational author. Trump did best in the Republican primaries with people who attended church the least. I'm talking about in 2016 when there was actually a competitive Republican primary process. Trump was the preferred candidate of the more secular Republicans and also of self-described white evangelicals who don't happen to go to church very often. So they're interested perhaps in Christian cultural primacy rather than sort of their connectedness to a local church. So it was not really clear that Trump was going to do as well as he ended up doing in 2016. Partly the reason he did so well is Hillary Clinton clearly was a candidate who repelled a lot of white evangelicals. She had been unpopular with that voting bloc for going on a quarter century by the time she won the Democratic presidential nomination. So that certainly helped. But it's clear that in the intervening years, Trump has developed something of a relationship with the evangelical voters and has become a lot more connected to that part of the Republican base. And they and gun owners are among the rank and file Republicans who are thickest on the ground, especially in some of the states that are really going to matter from an electoral college perspective. So Trump, I think the Trump campaign is pretty hopeful they can avoid any backsliding with evangelicals this time around.
Now, pollsters, when they factor evangelicals, exclude Black Protestants from that category.
Right.
Do they exclude or include Hispanic evangelicals?
Typically, when we're talking about white evangelicals, we are talking about non-Hispanic white evangelicals, that these groups are broken out when you're talking about polling and when you're doing exit polls. Obviously, that's not an exact science, but that does tend to be what we're talking about when we use that term.
And I recall George W. Bush got a historic high among evangelical Hispanics. Was it above 40%?
Yes, well, George W. Bush got above 40, well, it's believed he got above 40% in 2004 among Hispanics as in total, as a group, which would be the record among Republicans. There is some quibbling about whether the 44% that appeared in some of the exit polls, whether that was correct. You know, there were some other exit polls that in more heavy Latino populated areas that undermined that, but it appears that it was no less than 40%, which would definitely be on the high end for a Republican presidential candidate. And the Trump campaign has said that they think that they can do that well among Hispanic voters this time, which would certainly be remarkable because they have very different very different rhetoric, very different policies about immigration. There is a tendency among people associated with the Trump campaign to exaggerate, but this is maybe not implausible when you look at this week's Quinnipiac poll, which showed Trump trailing Biden by 10 points overall, but still winning about 36% of the Hispanic vote. So it does look like some of their outreach with that group has paid off. And Hispanic military veterans and Hispanic Protestants, particularly evangelical, tend to be the most Republican of that voting bloc.
And in terms of motivating issues for white evangelicals, they are, of course, pro-life,
right,
pro-traditional marriage to the extent that's still an issue in play,
right,
concerned about religious liberty issues, domestic, but also overseas.
right.
What else would motivate white evangelicals?
Certainly the courts are a major factor for white evangelicals. A lot of the issues of importance to white evangelicals are decided as much by the Supreme Court and lower federal courts as they are by Congress or any president. So having a conservative majority on the Supreme Court and having conservatives elsewhere in the federal judiciary tends to be very important to that group. And that's really where Trump made a lot of his inroads with white evangelicals in 2016, promising to put a conservative in Antonin Scalia's seat. That seat remained vacant after Scalia's death because Senate Republicans would not confirm President Barack Obama's nominee to that seat, Merrick Garland. They wouldn't even hold a vote for him. So that seat became a real rallying cry during the 2016 race. And this time, President Trump can run on the record of having appointed Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. Now, Gorsuch did disappoint some white evangelicals with a ruling expanding the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to cover sexual orientation and gender identity in banning hiring discrimination. So there are concerns about how that would affect certain Christian social welfare organizations that want to uphold biblical sexual ethics in their hiring practices, faculties, non-clergy employees of Christian colleges and educational institutions. But overall, social conservatives, more broadly speaking, and white evangelicals specifically, have been satisfied with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and have been happy with the types of judges President Trump is putting on the court. Religious liberty is clearly a very big motivating issue for white evangelicals, and just a feeling of sort of cultural sort of besiegement and battlement. And Trump has been, in particular, very skilled at playing on that aspect of the white evangelical psyche and saying that he is an ally of these voters and he will protect them from people who would marginalize them or read them out of the public square.
Now, the demonization of white evangelicals has become increasingly common, presumably because they are seen as a key voting bloc and an obstacle on key culture war issues. There was the infamous New York Times column headline essentially faulting evangelicals for spreading the pandemic because of their insistence on gathering at their churches. And there's been a plethora of books about so-called Christian nationalism, which is tied to white nationalism, et cetera, in a very sinister fashion. We had some of this kind of rhetoric during the Bush years in terms of warnings, dire warnings about impending Christian theocracy.
Right.
It doesn't seem to be talk of theocracy, but the focus now is on Christian nationalism, whatever that is. How do you respond to that?
Well, certainly that has become a major focus in the Trump years. So it's less about theocracy than the idea that white evangelicals are interested less in theology than they are in a sort of form of white identity politics. And, you know, there obviously is a degree to which the Trump appeal to white evangelicals is about their place in the country, their place in the culture, very specifically, which has always been a partial motivating factor of at least some elements of the religious right, if not the entirety of the religious right. The religious right, which is a very much an evangelical dominated movement, has been split between people who are looking to sort of carve out a space for their faith in the public sphere and sort of defend their private prerogatives versus people trying to uphold a form of public morality versus people sort of concerned about the place of Christianity in the culture more broadly. And that third group has become pretty important to the Trump coalition. So the idea that there is a nationalistic element to sort of Trump's appeal, I think is indisputable. Whether there's anything remotely approximating white nationalism that commands any significant following among white evangelicals, I think it's pretty laughable to assert that that's the case. However, there are, even among white evangelicals, people who are concerned that voting bloc's identification with Trump will be bad for the church and for the faith longer term, that it will make it harder to win converts in a demographically diverse society because Trump has such a narrow appeal and has been known to offend people on race-related matters. That's why I think it's interesting that the voting bloc he seems to have most clearly succeeded in alienating from the Republican Party is actually college-educated white suburbanites.
Now, Jerry Falwell Sr. was a key figure in politically mobilizing the white evangelicals and the wider religious right
Yes.
30 years ago, through the Reagan years, through the years of both Presidents Bush.
Yes.
His son never occupied a similar perch politically until 2016 and suddenly arose as a prominent supporter of candidate Donald Trump. Jerry Falwell Jr., of course, has suffered a scandal of late. Does that have any impact at all on the politics of this year's election?
Well, the interesting thing about Jerry Falwell Jr. as a political figure is he was somewhat elevated by Trump. Probably he was as elevated by Trump as he elevated Trump. So during the 2016 primaries, then candidate Trump had difficulty getting prominent evangelical supporters. So he actually ended up having to sort of go out and recruit his own and make some people who weren't really very prominent in those circles much more prominent as Trump supporters. It's similar to the phenomenon of when cable's news networks found that a lot of their existing conservative pundits were never Trumpers, and they had to go out and get new pundits who were pro-Trump. Donald Trump, as a candidate, initially was not the favored religious right candidate. So when he wanted to do outreach to those voters, he had to find new leaders who would help him do that. He doesn't have that problem in 2020. But Jerry Falwell Jr., even though he had not been as politically active as his father, shared his father's name. So when he was willing to support Donald Trump, it did give some evangelical sort of street cred, cachet, if you will, to Trump. And Falwell Jr. became a much more important political figure and was certainly invited on television to comment much more frequently on political matters than he ever had been previously. He really had been focused on Liberty University, which was founded by his father, while his brother succeeded him in the pulpit at his father's church. So Jerry Jr. really, prior to 2016, was not the biggest player in evangelical politics. I don't think his fall from grace is going to have a very significant impact on the 2020 race. President Trump doesn't need, now people who are much more mainstays of the Christian right are willing and able to campaign for him because he now has a record and he's now established connections with these groups. But it will, I think, for white evangelicals who are a little uncomfortable about their vote for Trump, it might be a cautionary tale, and certainly for evangelicals who are trying to persuade other white evangelicals, and nearly 1 in 5, even though Trump won by a landslide margin, that's still nearly 1 in 5 white evangelicals voted for other candidates in 2016. Some of them may look at Jerry Jr. as sort of a cautionary tale. This is what happens. You get led astray if you become too closely tied to, too closely associated with Trump.
And there are this year a few prominent evangelicals who had not publicly supported Donald Trump in 2016, who, because they believe his administration has delivered on key issues, have said they will support him this time. Al Mohler, president of Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, would be prominent in that category.
Right.
So there's that going on. And also, it seems to me that whereas 20 and 30 years ago, there were large public organizations that rallied the religious right, the Moral Majority back in the 1980s, the Christian Coalition in the 1990s.
Right.
There really is no equivalent today, and perhaps there are not the same equivalent large gatekeepers for evangelicals these days. Evangelicals have always been a very decentralized religious demographic. They don't have their own bishops, much less their own pope to speak for them. And so perhaps more than ever, they're just simply relying on their own independent networks and their own access to information through social media and so forth.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, Ralph Reed does still have an organization that tries to register and mobilize evangelical voters. You know, Tony Perkins is still running the Family Research Center. Perkins and Reed have been supportive of Trump this year, as has Richard Land, longtime Southern Baptist Convention official, active in conservative social causes for a number of years. And Franklin Graham has been fairly friendly with the president, but you don't have the same gatekeepers that you once did. Organizations like the Christian Coalition and Moral Majority don't necessarily speak for white evangelicals to the degree that those organizations and leaders once did. So the question then becomes, is this a good thing? And does this mean that there's just more independent thought among white evangelicals? Or does this mean that white evangelicals become a lot more like the surrounding culture, getting their cues from social media, from Twitter, from friendly news sites? And you know, do they really then engage in politics in very much the same way that everybody else in the country does?
And then finally, Jim, some on the left side of the political spectrum have touted and even celebrated the decline of, as they describe it, white Christianity,
Sure.
demographic decline, almost treating white Christians as though they are dinosaurs soon to be extinct.
Right.
And so I guess there's the question, for how much longer will white evangelicals remain a cohesive and significant political force? Or is that portrayal of them in demographic decline exaggerated? Or will the rise of Hispanic and other immigrant evangelical groups that are growing essentially supplement whatever decline there is among white evangelicals?
That's a very good question, and the reality is, you know, there is a degree of demographic decline among the entire Republican electoral coalition. You know, obviously the Democrats like to talk about their own voting blocks as the coalition of the ascendant, but this has been talked about really for a number of years without it really getting to the point that Republicans can't win elections. And so, yes, there is certainly decline. Yes, there is the diversification of the country is proceeding rapidly. At the same time, as long as white evangelicals are cohesive, they will be a significant voting bloc because they do still have a large number of votes to give. And then finally, liberal critiques of evangelicals when they're white, definitely they're most comfortable making those criticisms. But I think, as we've seen in our own church, Mark, that liberals are not very happy when people of color aren't voting with them on social issues. They tend to assume that people will always vote a sort of center-left rainbow coalition type of politics. But when they have a certain level of financial comfort, they begin to vote their religious values, which particularly in the case of Hispanic evangelicals, much more closely aligns with what white evangelicals believe. If those voters also become a part of the Republican electoral coalition, we then are having a very different conversation than one of decline.
Jim Antle, editor at the Washington Examiner and fellow Methodist, thank you for an insightful conversation.
Thank you, Mark.